Hi, I would like to share with you some thoughts on a new phenomenon, which is the cluster organizations. Lately, we've seen more and more cluster organizations as the new standard for cluster management. And also, we have seen as cluster organizations are gaining power through their own boards to demand to regions, to nations, and to Europe their own funds. For us, this is a double-sword edge. On one hand, is positive because we believe that these cluster organizations can go beyond governments and, of course, help organize some clusters and produce change. But also, we believe there's a danger because they can become so institutionalized that they prevent change from happening, represent some private or small group interests and not all the cluster. And also we believe that they are hampering the power or the role of regions in regional development. So let's put it briefly, and to prove it or to hold these arguments, we will use the work of some academicians, basically on point 1 on the need of cluster adaptation, on point 2 on how change is produced in complex organizations. The third point will be about how should these organizations be, and fourth on the role of regions. So let's start with the first. What makes a cluster successful? Clusters in the end are ecosystems that create their own routines to be more productive, like ecosystems in nature would do. And what happens to these ecosystems? It's many academicians, but also the theory from Darwin and natural ecosystems that tell us that the ecosystem is not stronger because the agglomeration is bigger, but because of its capacity of adaptation to new realities. And what's happening to clusters nowadays? That they receive more and more changes. The path of change is getting quicker, both from globalization, technological change, and also from the change in the industry structure. So as, for example, the concentration of retail. And what happens to clusters? Do they behave equally in different stages of their life cycle? The theory also shows that the capacity of adaptation of a cluster differs, and that the maximum synergies are produced when the cluster is growing, when it's forming itself. But when it becomes mature, these capacities that help the cluster outperform the rest of the industry, be more innovative, be more productive, go against it. Why? Because basically the cluster has organized itself, as we have said, to be productive under certain conditions. If these conditions change, the cluster is less agile to respond than other structures, other companies that are outside of the cluster, as some academicians are showing, and we can see in this graph where the cluster is performing worse than the companies that are not in the cluster once the cluster reaches its maturity. So the same reasons that make a cluster productive, in a way, we can say that will turn against it under new conditions. So under these new conditions, the cluster has to change. And what's the theory about change in complex organizations or complex systems as a cluster is? There are many theories. We'll use as a basis the one from Kotter, and I'll summarize it for you to make it simple. The first thing that is important for changing complex organizations is that it normally doesn't happen casually. It needs a trigger. Kotter calls it a sense of urgency, a flag raised. The second thing to produce this change is that you need a vision, you need a direction, and this vision has to be short, concise, and you have to be able to communicate it. And what happens, or who is constructing this vision? It's not normally the leaders from the past. It's not normally the companies that were doing well in the past or the institutions that are managing the cluster. It's all about new references, and it's also about eliminating these older references that were or will defend the past. You need the visionaries, you need the new leaders, and you need to eliminate the past obstacles. Once you have all that, is then time to generate action. Action is the demonstrator for change, so you need quick wins. And then is when this change is demonstrated that you can institutionalize it and produce the institutions, organizations that will rule or that will dominate this action plan. So let me summarize it again. In complex organizations, change doesn't happen casually. You need a trigger, you need a vision, you need to have new references and eliminate obstacles, and finally, you need demonstrators and a new framework to produce action. So, do cluster organizations help in this process? Are cluster organizations the solution? In 2012, there were already more than 1,000 cluster organizations. As we said, they are the new normal. And in a survey they made in Europe based on 254 European cluster organizations, here's the data. 90% were managed by a previously existing institution. So here we are breaking one of the rules, which is to have new references and not be based on existing institutions. Also, one thing that strikes and one argument in favor of cluster organizations is that they are private-led. So they are based on the market demand. But 60% of it's public funding. It's not the privates that are managing it. So in here we are saying that you're creating, in a way, a lobby to obtain public funding. Also, one thing that strikes is that clusters are already organization rich. Here we have an example from the Australian wine cluster. It could be any of the clusters that are organic and that have been long established in any country. So in here you can see that from the 30s to the current times, organizations have been forming themselves probably by what we can see in the lower part, which is new demands or new realities for the clusters. So if clusters are already organization rich, should we create a new cluster organization? Or should we think of a framework for change? What's the difference between an organization and a framework for change? The fundamental difference is that an organization exists in its own right, while a framework for change exists only when there's need for change, and after that it will die, extinguish itself, it will have no reason to persist or to continue operating. So a framework for change would, on one hand, go for a vision. It would include probably the existing organizations plus something new and include the government. And what would it do? Basically, see if the actions that are needed for the cluster for change are actions that already existed and potentiate those, or if these actions have to be modified, maybe we need new actions to trigger change, or maybe we need to produce certain collaborations. But after that, the framework for change, after this is accomplished, then it's done its mission. So summarizing it, to have a framework for change, first, we need a plan. We need a plan of action. We need, of course, to construct this framework. Does this framework have to be a cluster organization? It depends. It can vary if the cluster is already organization rich, just from a memorandum of understanding or an agreement between the institutions, from the leadership of one of the institutions agreeing with the others, to, of course, in certain cases in which the cluster is reinventing completely or where dramatic changes are occurring, you then need a cluster organization. But this cluster organization is not measured by the performance of the organization itself, but by what it achieves related to the plan of action. So what we are going to see if it's doing its homework in terms of actions to be modified, implemented, and if that's done on time. Why I'm saying this? Because the way that we have found in Europe to measure a cluster is by putting labels. We have gold label clusters, silver, bronze. And how do we put these labels? Basically, we put them based on the process. Is the cluster manager excellent? Is he sending lots of communications? Does he have a lot of interaction? Does he have a private board? But we are not measuring if they have a strategy, not for the organization, but for the companies. Do they have a vision for the future of the cluster? Do they have an action plan? And are they fulfilling this plan? Are they doing what they are requested to do? So then creating the adequate change. Now we've seen or questioned the way that those institutions have to work, those cluster organizations. And let's add the other ingredient, it's the role of the regional government. Let's first talk about clusters and regional governments. In fact, it was regional governments that started cluster policies. And that was for a reason. What was the reason? That basically clusters are very relevant to regional economies. In here we have an example of the shoe cluster in Alicante. The shoe cluster in Alicante has a concentration of about 1,000 companies around 3-4 main small cities, and it's not a mono economy, but it's very important for each of these cities, the weight of the industry, and many indirect services depend on it. So when the cluster is not performing well, all the region is at risk. And here in this picture we can see the protest of the population with the imports of cheap shoes. Basically, clusters in Europe account for 38% of the employment and 20 to 50% of the turnover. In some regions, this is even higher. For example, in Catalonia, it accounts in the main sectors for 50 to 70% of the turnover and around 50% of the companies. So when we talk about clusters, we are not talking about clusters themselves, or it is not only about clusters, it is about the region prosperity, it's about the prosperity in a territory. In this sense, and to create prosperity, regions have policies, and these policies can be fed by the cluster initiatives. Cluster initiatives provide the objective knowledge to improve competitiveness policies in the regions. So we have these then two critical issues for regional development, in which clusters on one hand represent an important part of the economy, and secondly they feed or they improve the regional policies on competitiveness. So clusters are fundamental, and with the new way in which cluster organizations work, in which they receive direct funding from the nations and from multilateral organizations, in here we have a problem in which regions are losing control on clusters. So maybe regions need to go, of course, beyond the importance of one cluster to think about the whole territory and regain the control over their policies. So what are the takeouts of this short presentation? Basically, the first and more important is that when we need change, we have to create frameworks, but frameworks make sense with a purpose. And this is how they should be evaluated, in how they are contributing to change, not in how they work themselves or how the organization to create change is performing on its own. The second and more important is that cluster-based policies are about prosperity. And prosperity goes beyond the importance of a cluster, but clusters are fundamental to fit these regional prosperity policies, these regional development policies in which regions we still believe are the optimal unit. So in this sense, we believe that we have to strike a balance over the power of clusters in terms of organizations and the power of regions, and we think that regions should regain control over cluster policies.